Hello, everyone, and welcome to Lesson 11-3. Today, we're going to take a deeper dive into the war in Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda was the target of this war. That was the main focus, and that's why we went after them. But it's worth knowing a little bit about them before the September 11th, 2001 attacks. Al-Qaeda exists to, quote, combat the Jewish Christian alliance to destroy Islam. They believe that there is a plan to eliminate Islam and that Al-Qaeda must work against this. To do this, they use suicide attacks as their primary method of striking targets. Now, its leader, Osama bin Laden, began organizing these attacks dating all the way back to 1992. In 1993, they made an unsuccessful attempt to destroy the World Trade Center. This was their first big action against the United States of America. Now, between 1993 and 2001, Al-Qaeda attacked 2 American embassies and an American warship, among other targets. But on September 11th, 2001, they hijacked 4 American airplanes and crashed them into targets in the United States. 2 planes hit the World Trade Center, a symbol of the American economy. 1 struck the Pentagon, a symbol of the American military. And a 4th crashed in Pennsylvania. It was supposed to hit the United States Capitol building, the symbol of American government. Now, the fallout from this attack, American intelligence agencies connected Al-Qaeda to the attacks and knew that the organization was protected by the Taliban in Afghanistan. The Taliban was a group that had taken control of that country years earlier. Now, the Taliban was warned to surrender bin Laden or surrender power, meaning if you don't hand him over, we will take you out. They refused to turn over bin Laden, and so the United States of America and our NATO allies prepared for war. Remember that NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a group of nations that came together for mutual defense. If one was attacked, all would respond. America was attacked, and so all NATO nations prepared for war. The attack on the United States, the refusal of the Taliban to cooperate, triggered this response from NATO, and over 32 nations sent troops to Afghanistan beginning in October of 2001. The United States of America and the UK is the United Kingdom, Great Britain, England, all of those. They provided most of the troops for this effort. Now, NATO bombed the Taliban, and we relied on another group, the Northern Alliance, which is a group of Afghan warlords, to provide most of the ground troops. So we did the airstrikes, weakened the Taliban, and then the Northern Alliance soldiers would march in and clean it up. The combination of NATO bombs and Northern Alliance fighters caused the Taliban to flee Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan, in November. So the Taliban withdrew from power. With the Taliban removed, Afghans then created a new government. The tribal leaders called for something called a Loya Jirga. This is a grand assembly to govern the nation until a constitution could be written and elections could be held. In 2004, 3 years later, the Afghans then put forth Hamid Karzai as their choice for president. This was the first president of the modern Afghan nation right here. Now, Karzai's government was very corrupt, had a lot of problems, and although he is no longer in power, I wrote this a while ago, he did serve out his terms as president. The early phase in the Afghan war led to the ousting of the Taliban and to the death or capture of about 2/3 of Al-Qaeda's leadership. Al-Qaeda was severely weakened by these strikes, but these victories were not complete, and the war has continued to drag on, sometimes not going all that well. Now, in December, early on, of 2001, NATO pinned Al-Qaeda into the caves of Tora Bora. These are a cave complex near the Pakistan border. Now, the Taliban called for what we now recognize was a false truce. They wanted the fighting to stop. They had said that they were going to surrender, But instead, this false truce was simply a lag in the fighting that allowed the remaining al-Qaeda leadership to escape across the border into Pakistan. Bin Laden then hid in Pakistan until he was killed in an American raid 10 years later in 2011. All practical leadership of al-Qaeda is now in the hands of this man right here, Ayman al-Zawahiri, who is the leader of al-Qaeda, though al-Qaeda is a severely weakened organization these days. The United States had some problems with Pakistan related to this war. Al-Qaeda now operates mostly out of northwest Pakistan, having crossed the Afghan border into that nation. Now, Pakistan has joined a lot of NATO efforts, but has not been very effective in stamping out al-Qaeda within their nation. Pakistan will also not allow NATO ground forces to enter their country. They're doing this out of fear of rising extremism. They don't want to invite Western soldiers, non-Muslims, into their country because of what Muslim extremists within their own country would do. Remember, bin Laden's big issue here was Western influence and Western presence, the presence of Americans and Europeans in Muslim countries. Pakistan wants to show that they can handle their own problems, that they don't need Western help. And inviting the United States in might actually cause more problems. But this has really strained the relationship between the United States and Pakistan because Pakistan is not very effective at fighting against these extremists. Beginning in 2003, the Taliban in Afghanistan began to recover. They started to gain ground again. They had been on the run, on the hide, not doing very well. But in 2003, a great thing happened for them. The United States and the United Kingdom became distracted by a war in Iraq. And as the United States began to shift men, money, and attention over to that war, the Taliban were able to slowly reconquer most of the country. Most of this reconquering was done between 2003 and 2009, but with slower progress happening since then. Afghans grew very unhappy with Hamid Karzai and with the American troop presence in the country. The Afghans as a whole don't usually like the Taliban, but have come to see that the Taliban are there permanently. They're not going anywhere, whereas eventually the Americans will leave. And since the Taliban will eventually control the country, Afghans have come to accept them, and they have slowly reconquered the nation. The Afghan government proper is only in control of the capital city of Kabul and a little bit of the surrounding areas, where the Taliban has reconquered much of the country. The Afghan war, however, has continued. This war is now well beyond its 12th year. I wrote this lesson a few years ago. The war is now in its 17th year. It's the longest war in U.S. history. No longer the second longest. It is past the Vietnam War. In 2009, President Obama further expanded the war. In 2010, NATO alliance set 2014 as the deadline for combat missions. The war was set to end in 2014, although troop presence may continue much longer, and there are still troops in Afghanistan today in 2018. Combat missions have really wound down for the Americans. We're in more of a support and defensive role, and yet we are still there. President Obama, during his presidency, chose to focus more on Afghanistan than on Iraq, and made this war his main focus. See, Bush had turned around the Iraq War later in his presidency by leaning on this man, General Petraeus, to take control. And he had implemented a troop surge, a dramatic increase in American troops there, in an effort to gain support from the Iraqis. These troops came in for defensive, not offensive purposes. Obama said if this strategy worked in Iraq, it could work in Afghanistan, and gave General Petraeus overall command in Afghanistan in 2010. He did improve the war, but because of other problems, later resigned from that job. I hope that you were able to learn something from today's extended lesson on the war in Afghanistan, a war that still continues. And I hope that you will join us next time. Farewell.